Accessible staging. What is it? How do we do it? How can Broadway do better by the large portion of the population with photosensitivity issues and the knowledge that 1/5 of the population is disabled without sacrificing the quality of their directorial intent? As the unofficial official Broadway Access reviewer, boy do I have the video for you. Yes, I did just write that intro for the sake of having a great Instagram reel. Anywho, hello my dears! If you've been following me for a while on here or a very short time on the Instagrams, you know that accessible theater is kind of my thing. And since I moved to New York City, I've been making access reviews for different Broadway and off-Broadway shows to replace the "there is a strobe somewhere in this 3-hour show" warning signs that I personally find wildly unhelpful, particularly because a lot of shows have moving lights that cause strobing effects but then don't classify that as a strobe, so they don't even warn you for it. And also, warning isn't helpful if you don't know where the warning is for. So I have been going to see shows with my silly little neon pink notebook here and taking note of where the bathrooms are, the wheelchair access of the space, of where the best seats for light sensitive people are, content warnings, and every single flashing or moving light or loud noise in the design of the show, and putting that all together into a cohesive spot for people to find that resource if that would make their theatrical experience better. They're posted both on my Instagram and on my website if you're interested, and if a new one's coming out, it will come out on Wednesday mornings, generally. 99% of the time. If a show's about to close, I will post it earlier, but generally Wednesday mornings is when you're going to find them. I already studied accessible staging as a part of the disability theater movement before I started doing this. It was part of my thesis research, and I also mentioned it briefly in my video on relaxed performances last year, but after talking to a lot of theater professionals lately about accessible staging, I figured it was time for an updated video on what that actually looks like as a guide for people who want to deliberately make their shows more accessible but don't know how to go about that. And this time I can use actual examples of currently open or recently open shows to explain it. But first things first, for friends who need it, I'm a white person in my early 20s with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a light green shirt with dark green leaves on it and a dark green button-up open on top, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has leaves on it. Also, just from a personal experience perspective, before we get into the meat of this video, when I go to these shows, I usually get a lot of questions because I almost always go alone and I take a lot of notes throughout. I've been asked if I'm a student a bunch of times. Somebody asked if I was a designer, and one person asked if I was one of the new swings for the show, which was an honor. I really appreciated that one. But either way, it's a great excuse to go see shows. I enjoy doing it, though my bank account does not, and it has taught me a lot about the do's and the don'ts of what different kinds of accessible staging can look like in a much more real sense than all of the ideas discussed in my textbooks. And now I gift this information to you. Hopefully it is helpful. I never know if my content reaches the audience that it needs to, so maybe this is a little bit futile. I have no idea. Also, I need to tone down the energy. I'm speeding through words right now. We're gonna talk specifically here about how staging affects the audience, i.e. lighting design, sound design, scent design, yes, that's a thing, set design, and how actors move on stage. If you want to know more about how staging affects the people who work on the show in the sense of accessible show design, i.e. making rehearsals accessible and working theatrically with disabled folks. About a month ago, I released a documentary about how we staged the lightly doomed show of the world's first all neurodivergent cast and crew production of Curious Incident that will help way more in that regard. It also talks about this stuff as well, so you can watch that up here. The general in summary of what I'm trying to say is I've said all of these things separately before in different places, I think, so now I'm putting them all in one spot so I can more easily send it to people as a resource. Cool? Cool. One of the first questions I get when discussing accessible staging with people is usually, but doesn't that already exist with those autism-friendly performance things? And the answer is technically yes, in practice no. I've spoken before about relaxed performances, you can watch that up here. Up here, I don't know which side is on, one of the sides. On Broadway, they're usually called autism-friendly performances, which is inherently problematic wording. I'm gonna get to that in a moment. But the general thing is that they're actually quite inaccessible. The first is literal accessibility in a not disability sense. If a show is going to do one, it's going to be one a year, if even, and the shows that tend to do relaxed performances are also more family-friendly and or child-oriented shows, which I enjoy. I do enjoy shows like that, but as an autistic adult, I would much rather see Parade or Sweeney Todd than Aladdin. The second is disability-related accessibility. I've never been to a relaxed performance, but based on the research I read for my last video about them, they would not be an accessible experience for me. What I love about theater is that it's a space where you can sit in silence with a bunch of other people and enjoy and feel an art piece together without much distraction or need for human interaction. Relaxed performances are structured so that people who need to get up and walk around or leave or make noise or eat during the show are welcome to do that. For me, that would make it impossible to enjoy the show, and I would be infinitely more overwhelmed and more likely to have a panic attack and or meltdown. So even though the lighting and the sound might be more accessible to me in that situation than a typical performance, generally I would find a typical performance to be more accessible to my access needs, even if it had 5 strobe lights throughout. Also, back to the title autism-friendly performance or sensory-friendly performance, these shows are more accessible for people with all kinds of different non-autism disabilities as well. So calling them autism-friendly makes it seem exclusive to one population, which means all the other people who need this as a resource are a lot less likely to use it. And as I just mentioned, these performances are not necessarily sensory-friendly for everyone, hence why the most commonly used term, at least in the UK, is relaxed performance, in that the sensory aspects of the staging are relaxed and the social norms of the space are relaxed. I would love if Broadway changed their language on that. If anybody's watching, it knows people to make that happen, you're welcome to. These performances are very important. We do need to have them. We need to have definitely more of them, but they're a very different thing from an accessibly staged performance. An accessibly staged performance is not a one performance specific thing. It doesn't really change any of the theatrical social norms. It's something that is baked into how a show is built from day one of rehearsals, or I guess before rehearsals, because like production, set design, lighting design, that happens before rehearsals. But creating this kind of staging requires an understanding of its purpose. I've spoken to lighting designers who know that a strobe might be a problem, but they think, oh, only for a handful of people, we'll just warn for it, it's fine, we'll put it in there. But then when I have explained to them that over 10% of the population has migraines, and most people with migraines consider strobes to be a trigger, and that would therefore alienate a tenth of their audience with that design choice, they've pulled the strobe. In at least 3 different cases, I've had that happen. Most clinical research into photosensitivity is very epilepsy focused, occasionally touching on migraines, occasionally touching on autism, but as a human who has spoken to a lot of other humans, disabled and not, large amounts of flashing lights and moving lights make a whole lot of people motion sick. Next time you see a show and a sudden light on the audience happens, look around, see how many people flinch and or go like this. It's the majority of people. The numbers of people for whom it's medically necessary to avoid these things are not super massive, but making it an easier, less jarring theatrical experience for the large number of people who do not medically fit into that category is just as important as a theater maker, at least to me and hopefully to other people as well. We get really caught up in the this many people are disabled, so we need to make sure that they feel included thing, and forget that disability is a very fluid category and accessibility makes everybody's lives better. We're the reason you have ramps for your strollers, text messages on your phones, and those large doors getting off the subway that are way easier than the turnstiles when you're holding a bunch of groceries. That's because of disabled people. Our accessibility made your life easier. While I dream of a world where the theater can pick up ideas from disability theater, such as pre-show tactile tours for blind and low vision folks, wider seats for different kinds of bodies, more than one ADA compliant bathroom per theater, non-gendered bathrooms, ADA compliant backstages, visual stories of what to expect available before the date of the show, sensory spaces and quiet areas and much better captioning devices than what we have right now, I'm a realist. I don't expect Broadway to do that anytime soon, if ever. If I could pick one of the above, I would say that visual stories are the easiest for them to implement and make the most impact, should definitely be implemented. My Access reviews are an incomplete version of that. If you don't know what I'm referring to, I've linked an example in the description for you. What I'm trying to say is that those things are not realistically happening, and I acknowledge that. Accessible staging is a thing that is already happening to some degree by some directors and designers, probably by accident, and I think that if a wider discussion were to happen and this kind of language was given to it for more people in the industry, it could become deliberate and actually purposefully integrate itself into the shows that we see and make the theatrical experience better for everybody. Also, might be slightly utopic, but it feels a lot more attainable than the other stuff, so I'm going to convince myself that this is possible because I need it to be possible. So I'm going to break down the things by design category that are access issues, and we'll try to use examples from shows I've recently seen, studied, and or worked on to illustrate my point. If I'm able to find clips from those shows that demonstrate what I'm talking about, I will include them on screen as well. And also, genuinely no hate to any of these shows at all. I genuinely enjoyed every single one of them. Every show has about the same number of things that I know as potential access issues. I'm just using these things as examples of what I pick out as a potential access issue that people may not realize could be a potential problem, so that more people can learn from this. Also, since I work in the theater as a performer and a director, I should probably mention my tolerance for handling most of this is fairly high at this point. If you cast me in a show today that had moving lights on me and loud sound design, wouldn't be my favorite thing in the world, but I would be completely fine. I talk about this stuff because a lot of my friends who love theater have severe reactions to these things, and a younger, much sicker me also had severe reactions to these things and felt like I was not welcome in the theater because of it. Straight up strobes are still an issue for me. Beetlejuice and Here Lies Love are my worst nightmare, but the rest of this I talk about not because it directly affects me, but because I care about my community and want more of us to be able to be safely involved in the creation and appreciation of theater. One person's experience is one person's experience, but I try to err on the side of caution and note literally everything that would affect the most sensitive person, so that's yeah. So let's start with lighting, which is going to be our biggest category. Sorry, lighting designers, and then we're going to work our way through everything else. The most obvious lighting issue that I just mentioned is straight up strobe lights. White strobes are the most dangerous form of strobe because they are the brightest, and there's the most contrast between lights typically when those are used. I once saw a show that used an amber strobe light, and I also saw one that used a blue strobe light. Those both were not my favorite, but they were way less bad than white strobes, which I thought was really interesting. Still hated it, still don't do it, but if you're going to choose one or the other, at least go for that. Either way, full strobes really don't exist that much in mainstream theater anymore, in my experience. There's one slightly off-white strobe in Hadestown at one point, but I haven't seen them anywhere else on Broadway in years, I think. There were a lot in Titanic, but we're going to talk about that as more of a case study later in this video. Other flashing lights, like single or double flashes, i.e. rather than fiddling with a light switch a bunch of times, you just flick it on and off once or twice, are also technically strobes. They're not usually seen to be as much of a problem and are still used very frequently because of that. There's been at least one in every show I've seen this season, I think, except for Parade. These range from quickly changing the lights a few times to the beat of a song to just really quick lighting changes to sharply break from one scene to the next. I am not opposed to one quick lighting shift if that holds artistic merit. I know we did that a few times in Curious to show a sharp mood change, and we discussed it a lot before we inputted that idea. It is very effective, and it's typically fine as long as it's not like 5 of them back to back within 10 minutes, if that makes sense. When they happen in songs, it's usually a bunch back to back to the point where it comes off as more of a slow-moving strobe than anything else, which is an issue, but the occasional sharp scene change usually is not too bad. One show that used it more liberally, but it felt purposeful and I was like pretty much okay with, is Shucked. There's one song called The Corn Mix where the storytellers walk you through some events and they talk while what is behind them is frozen, and then there's a sharp lighting change and what's behind them comes to life and then switches back and forth throughout the song. And sometimes these lighting changes became really close together, but it started out with long pauses between sections and then slowly sped up, so by the time it would have been maybe an issue, you knew what to expect from it, so it didn't feel sudden or surprising. And once it was at that more flashy point, it was over pretty quickly, so it wasn't like extended eye strain. It wasn't my favorite, but I understood why they did it. I thought it was really creative, so I was like, I'll get over it. There's a solid chance that very sharp lighting changes for scene breaks are more of an issue than I'm making them out to be right now, and I'm just defending them because I love them as a director. That could totally be the case. I'm gonna be real about it. I like a crisp scene change when necessary and relevant and deliberate, but just be aware of those things. But the kind of flashing light that I have heard zero people talk about is disco balls. They bother me to no end because they come across as strobes, but much less predictably, and also nobody's strobe warnings for them because nobody thinks they're strobes. If you have a shiny thing, a bright shiny thing, that's spinning around so the light can catch it and flash it onto people around it, that is a strobe. And something about them makes it really extra bad. I don't know if it's because the pieces of light are smaller or what's going on there. They bother me, though I think I might just have a grudge against them because they're a weird invention to begin with, and then you add the strobe problem and it gets more annoying. I'm ranting about disco balls. Am I okay? Another semi-flashing kind of light that can be an issue is when things rapidly change colors. In Shucked, for example, there was a bunch of set pieces that came out on stage that said Tampa in bright neon lettering, and then they changed color pretty quickly. I'm gonna get to the issue with the projections and bright LEDs in a bit, but this is also quite jarring and feels quite flashy. Slow fading between colors is totally fine. Hadestown does that with their uplights on the back of the stage during the show, but rapid shifts between colors are a problem. They have a strobing effect. Speaking of which, what I did see recently was a show dimming and raising the house lights a few times over and over again to let you know the show is about to start, both pre-show and during intermission. Please use a sound cue instead of a lighting cue for that. Messing with overhead lights, particularly if it's a very quick transition and happening a few times in a row, is effectively a strobe effect before the time when people are expecting potential lighting things to be happening, which is a genuine safety concern. But moving on to moving lights. Typically the moving lights I see in shows are either down lights straight from the stage or they're straight from the center, like coming from the mezzanine. If you're gonna pick one of the two, down lights on the stage moving around are much more accessible because the movement is centered on the floor, not on the moving humans. They're one of those things that if you have one or two in a show and they're deliberate and they're not white lights and it doesn't come across in a flashing way, I can be okay with. I can get over. They're just usually used during big dance numbers when there's a lot of movement to follow on stage, and the addition of a whole lot of moving lights all at the same time on top of that already existing movement on stage becomes really overwhelming and potentially nauseating very, very quickly. A less frequent use of moving lights that came up in Funny Girl and Ride the Cyclone are carnival lights, ones that flash on and off or move around in an arch and in a circular motion. Cyclone really likes the spinning lights motif. They're often too flashy for people, especially when moving from one end to the other or in a circle or spiral pattern. I didn't see Beetlejuice for obvious reasons, but based on the clips I've seen, I know that that was involved there too. They give off a very unique vibe, and I do not know how I'd propose a designer could get said vibe without that specific kind of lighting. So if it happens, it happens, but just less spinny, ideally, and moving less fast, ideally. Another very specific vibe from lighting that can be somewhat mitigated is flashlights. Curious Incident has a very famous flashlight scene that we wanted to do, so we played around with them to try to figure out how we wanted to go about it accessibly. The bottom line that we discovered is they're fine as long as they are not being moved around with great speed and they are not flashing on anybody in the audience, which means taking the time to learn where the beam is and how to point it so it does not go beyond the stage. Hadestown, for example, has headlamps that initially all point off stage in one direction, so it's not that much of an issue. And then they all face the audience and it's shining directly at them, and then they're dancing, so the flashlights are moving pointed at the audience. That's where it's a problem. In general, flashlights tend to be used in stark contrast to an entirely dark stage, and the small moving white light in contrast to a lot of dark is the biggest problem. Hopefully you're understanding that a lot of this has to do with movement and contrast more than anything. If there's a way to have a spotlight on somebody at like 30 to 50% or just a light stage wash in addition to the flashlight, as long as it's not shining directly into the audience, it has the same effect of being cool and showing you what's going on without causing potential harm to people. Now, speaking of pointed at the audience, I see this the most in rock musicals, but other shows do it as well sometimes. Having lights directly pointed at audience members is also a problem. Hadestown does it a lot in the second act. Parade had one, as did Funny Girl. In general, nobody particularly enjoys looking straight into lights, so in all honesty, I've never quite understood the hype about these, but they're bright. And when they move over the audience, whether the light itself is rotating to make a light move like this, or the light is fixed on something and it's moving up or down the back wall, it's very jarring. Anytime a light is pointed at the audience, I see everybody flinch and or lean backwards. I've never seen anybody particularly energized by it, except for Hadestown. They get a bit of a pass on this. I'm not going to put a video of what happens here because I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but the set design reveal of the main lights pointing at the audience is frankly its own character, and it is really, really, really cool. I do think that they could stand to be a good deal less bright and or could just be pointed in different directions. I think it would have been cool if they were like, if the light was like oozing out of behind the things rather than straight pointed at the audience. In general, I don't give Hadestown a pass for the use of a white strobe or for the flashlights on the audience, but the rest of Wait For Me is totally fine. They can do whatever the heck they want in that number. It may have lights moving around, lights reflecting through a fog machine, lights pointed at the audience, and really bright lights pointed toward the audience at the end. That's totally fine with me. I will forever be a Wait For Me apologist, and I will cry through the entire number, and nothing is gonna change that. So maybe I'm too biased to be making this video. Anyway, one thing to note about lighting design is that it is significantly more accessible to photosensitive people if you are sitting in the mezzanine, because less of it ends up shining down onto you or moving over you. That usually happens in the orchestra seating. The problem is that the mezzanine tickets are often both more expensive and require you to go upstairs to get there, which means anybody who uses a wheelchair or any other mobility aid or just struggles with stairs can't get there. But if you're physically and monetarily able and concerned about lighting, sitting on the sides and on the orchestra level are both things that will likely cause lighting to be more of an issue than central mezzanine seats, which are usually really expensive. Most wheelchair accessible seats in Broadway theaters tend to be more orchestra central, like in the middle, so there's less concern about the side lighting aspect at least. Another part of lighting that is kind of newish to the theater world are projections. Projections have always been a thing that I think should be used sparingly and deliberately. Some shows just kind of throw them in to have them or to avoid building a set, which is not my favorite because like the fun of theater is seeing a full set, but whatever. They're also a really, really great way to make your audience motion sick because they have to pay attention to what's moving on the screen and the moving performers in front of the screen. A great way to minimize this is to turn down the brightness and be careful with color choices for what goes on the screen and keeping the movement on the screen very slow. An example of a show that I really struggled with this with was Mean Girls. The screens are right at the height of the actors, often with very bright colors and very quick animations. When I saw between the lines, there were some faster moving projections that were similar to Mean Girls, but it was a different height from the actors, so it didn't really create that level of visual overwhelm. One show that used projections in the coolest and also most inaccessible possible way is, of course, the original Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, with everything in constant motion, blinking, flashing, writing and rewriting, appearing and disappearing, and in literally all directions. It was like a four-way, just projections everywhere. Was it cool? Absolutely. Did it make me physically ill when I saw it, and also large portions of the autistic community called them out for making the most inaccessible show possible for the people it's trying to represent? 100%. When we created projections for our production of Curious, we began by looking at different clips I'd taken at the Immersive Van Gogh exhibition and seeing what kinds of things caused significant eye strain and what kinds didn't. I don't specifically remember what clips I have on hand, so if there's a drastic audio change here, that's why. Let's have a nice little gander through different kinds of projections. Hello, Editing Sydney here. I've been going through the YouTube channels of a lot of different shows to
to try to pull clips for this video. And something that I've discovered is that every single show, regardless of how frequent strobes and flashing lights happen in the show or not, have all of them in their trailers. And I don't know if that means that we see flashing lights on a stage to be top level excitement and theater, and that's part of why this is such a problem, or what. But literally every single clip I'm pulling, I'm getting motion sick from editing this video because I've had to look at so many strobes just to find clips of other lighting design choices for you all. And I just think that's really interesting, and I wanted to note that.
If you want to skip this bit and not see flashing lights, you can go to this time code. This is kind of two visual overwhelms on top of each other, so it's not my favorite, but the movement is really cool, and that you can see where it's going, so it's less overwhelming. This is a different version of that, where the contrast is a lot less, and you can definitely see where it's going. Generally, having motion where it's clear where the motion is headed is really, really great if you're going to do motion. This one has awesome visual contrast in that it's not too much. I find this to be very visually stimmy, though I would love if it were a little bit slower. The twinkle in this one is great, it's fine, it's very gentle, but the contrast between the really light and the really dark makes it a hazard. If this were a different contrast, it would be a lot better. This one, the contrast isn't great. It could be less of a contrast, but again, you can see where the movement is going, and it's very soft movement, it's very gentle, and so it's a very simple kind of movement that's not super visually overwhelming, and it's moving pretty slowly. This is a different angle of it where it seems like a better contrast because of the lighting. This one's less bad, and it's also moving more gently. This last one is interesting. I think the lighting is definitely too flashy, and part of that is the contrast and the level of movement and how many things are moving at the same time. But if it were less, and the contrast were less, it would be much better. Also, if you ever want to hear my hot take feelings on these immersive art exhibits that primarily use the work of disabled artists and present it in an inherently inaccessible way, I have a video about that linked above, but that's not what this is about. Let's get back to our regular content. But my favorite use of projections ever was the recent revival of Parade. In general, it was one of the most accessibly staged shows I have ever seen, so I do rave about it a lot, but the projections were primarily black and white, meaning the contrast issues we often see with projections were not a thing. It framed the stage beautifully, so there wasn't a sharp cut between screen and not screen. They only used it to show the actual photos of the real historical figures behind the characters and the occasional location change, if I remember correctly, and any movement that took place was a really slow fade, a really slow movement either up or down or side to side, and like I think there was one really slow movement of like grass blowing in the breeze. It was a beautifully subtle use of projections, and I loved it. It was completely accessible to me. The next part of accessible staging is set and props design, also usually because of lighting. For example, the set design in Funny Girl had a big arch around the stage that was filled with carnival style lights, and then when those lights were off, it functioned effectively like a giant mirror, which then took every single light that was on stage and reflected it back out at the audience in a different angle, especially lights pointed towards the sides of the stage. And therefore it became a sort of strobe light situation by accident. Another instance I saw of this was a kind of mix between set and choreography in Hadestown. The way that they move the tables and some of the numbers reflect the lights straight onto the audience in brief flashes of shiny light. Hadestown had a lot of these issues, also with their cups becoming accidental strobes and Reeves' guitar becoming an accidental strobe. There's one number in Funny Girl where everybody was holding like handheld mirrors. That became an accidental strobe, and also Between the Lines had actual cell phones on stage, and that occasionally caught the light the wrong way and also caused this issue. This is obviously harder to fix with props because if you're using real things shiny, that happens. But I feel like it's something that could potentially be avoided if more attention were paid to it, or at least like minimized. Costuming can also cause this with really sparkly outfits, such as the Shiny Pants song in Funny Girl. I literally just wrote that. I don't know what song it was, but it's the Shiny Pants song, and the entirety of Celine Dion in Titanic. Also, while we're discussing costuming, did you know that complex patterns can also be a trigger for people? One of the things I was taught early on when I was learning ASL was to try to avoid wearing really bright or contrastingly patterned tops so as not to make people motion sick while I was signing. And it made me start to pay attention to how much clothing pattern affects eye strain just in general. I don't wear crazy patterns anymore. That's why. I can't think of any specific examples of this being an issue in shows other than like maybe Beetlejuice with all the black and white stripes, but also like eye strain and atypicality is the aesthetic of that show, so I can't get mad at it for being wildly inaccessible. Just like another interesting thing to ponder and include in here. And the last thing in regards to potential eye strain, movement on stage is not a major concern for this stuff, but it has been interesting to watch as we're seeing a rise in the minimalist device physical theater aesthetic in popular theater lately, how doing less on stage with intention can create the same effect as doing a gazillion things while being overwhelming, especially if you have deliberate contrast and you're very careful with the directorial decisions that you make. I think a part of this increase in slowing down movement in shows while making it more micro and specific is related to the increased use of turntables as well, but generally by taking design choices that could be wild lights and sound and spinning things and instead putting that all onto the bodies of the actors, it frees up your ability to make the staging more accessible and to be more precise and gentle with everything in the design, which then gives you a wider breadth of things to work with and build up to or down from in the show to give it more energy and tone. I'm not entirely positive that what I just said made sense. Hopefully it did. Basically, less is more, use your actors more, have the external design complement that more than be the show, because then you have more design choices that you can make and you have more flexibility. A really great example of how you can make a riveting show with really cool sound and lighting design and physical design without being inaccessible is the first third of Hadestown. Minus like one jarring train whistle and then a light that goes like this over the audience that's white, and also the shiny table reflections. But otherwise, it's incredible and completely accessible, and you just are enraptured by what's going on the stage without the need for crazy lighting design. Also, literally all of Parade and the majority of Between the Lines, that was off-Broadway, but they did make a pro shot that we're hopefully going to see at some point, so hopefully that will come back around shortly. Waitress was also really accessibly staged as well, if I remember correctly. This stuff is super possible. It just takes thinking creatively. And theater is moving in that design direction anyway. In my experience, I feel like shows right now are either going towards the minimalist physical theater aspects and making it feel more cozy and homey and wonderful, like also like Come From Away, like that kind of thing, or it's going full like Back to the Future, Beetlejuice, Here Lies Love. And I feel like maybe it's always been this way and I'm just paying more attention now, but I think it's really interesting, and like for my own personal taste of what I like from theater, the smaller, cozier, more accessible thing is my vibe anyway. And I don't know if I'm biased towards that because it's more accessible or because that's just the kind of theater that I like, but either way, the stuff is super possible. It's already happening. It just takes more thinking creatively and warning when it's not going to happen. But moving on, we now have scent design. This is a very niche problem that you would think is rare, but it is one that I've experienced 3 different times, so I decided to put it in here anyway. There are a lot of people who are allergic to smoke, aerosols, and other scented products, even in very tiny quantities. For me, weed is a problem. Like, it's a big problem. So the one scene where there was a real cigarette or cigar, I don't know the difference, smoke on stage in Parade, that wafted up to the audience, and that wasn't great for me. There was also a single puff of a fruity smelling vape in Between the Lines. That was an issue for me. I know that Percy sprays Febreze generally toward the audience somewhere in The Lightning Thief. I don't know if that scent carried because I didn't see it, but you know. These things do sort of immerse you in the story, but they also take some people very far out of it and can be a serious risk for those people. Or if not a serious risk, like it just is an inconvenience and a potential migraine trigger. And if those things were unscented, nobody in the audience would be like, I felt disconnected from the piece because I didn't smell their cigars. Like, whatever. If your set design is having a pie baked in the lobby of the theater, have at it. But anything that contains any sort of scented aerosol or smoke should generally be avoided if at all possible. Sound design on Broadway of late has also been a lot chiller than it used to be, or maybe I'm just used to it. I used to need earplugs every time I saw a show and I still thought it was too loud, and now I'm consistently fine. I would much rather a sound design be too loud throughout than switching between fine and suddenly way too loud. I feel like designers are getting on the same page with that of late, though any sudden loud whistle or noise that shakes the seats is generally not great. That being said, my second time seeing Hadestown, I knew where all of those things were, and I plugged my ears right beforehand and I was totally fine. But we were working on Curious, we talked a lot about accessible sound design, noticing that like electronic high-pitched things or things that create, for lack of a better word, a wub effect, as well as things that are really low vibrating bass, triggered tic attacks and migraines in various people on the team, and so we worked to try to minimize those as best we could. We also wanted some effects to seem loud without actually being sudden and loud, so we did lots of auditory illusions, like adding extra reverb to something and then having absolute silence following it so it sounded louder without making people jump. I'm sure that there are other tools in the sound realm to make audio more accessible. I'm going to be totally honest that that's where I was at in my thesis when the show fell apart, so I haven't been able to get myself to go back to researching it without getting really anxious quite yet. I hope to get to music and disability at some point and start making videos about it, but that's still, we're getting there. Also, in our show, we were very concerned about the loudness of confetti cannons because there's confetti at the end of the show. Our solution was to have my co-director climb onto the lighting grid and pour confetti on me from there. That's not possible in Broadway theaters for a number of reasons, but I do wonder what a more sensory-friendly option for a confetti cannon might be, because I cannot be the only one who's thought about this. Like, right, anyway, that brings us to the last thing that I usually trigger warn for, and that is audience participation. Obviously, all shows have some element of audience participation. I'm the kind of actor who will pick a few designated humans in the audience every night who that show is for, and I will perform generally toward them. But that is very different from actors directly speaking to and interacting with individuals in the audience. For many people, that can cause severe anxiety. I've been to shows where actors have like shaken the hands of people or patted them on the shoulder or whatever. That can cause panic attacks for some people, whether it's because of unwanted touch and they weren't expecting that, or because they have germ and touch-related OCD. That is a thing. Again, I'm a fan of audience participation. I think it's really great and really fun and can really add to a piece, but I think the way we go about it should be a bit clearer, like specifying beforehand that certain sections of the audience may be involved in audience participation, or offering some sort of marker a person can use if they do not want to be interacted with to make them feel safer. A really great example of audience participation done right is the way that mischief comedy shows do it. I'm particularly thinking of Peter Pan Goes Wrong, where everybody is involved in it during the show, and therefore you don't have to be involved in it if you don't want to. They're a little more forced hands-on during the pre-show bits, but generally most people know that that bit is coming, or they, can figure it out pretty quickly, and so they're less bothered by it. And they can also avoid it if they want to. Also, speaking of comedy, there are actually a solid amount of access things you can get away with in comedies that in any other show would not work without potential harm being caused. Audience participation is one of them. You can also bring up much darker concepts without problem. Should still trigger warn for them, but you can play with those a little bit more. There are some legitimate tips to making comedy more accessible. I wrote about that in my Shucked review because they did an amazing job with that. I also have a video about accessible comedy that you can check out in the card above, whichever side it's on. I don't remember. I'm not going to go into that here. But that is also a thing to keep in mind if you want your comedy to come across for all kinds of people. Basically, accessible staging isn't a consistent thing in that certain staging is the norm for certain genres. I was given a ticket to Jagged Little Pill like 2 years ago, and I declined it because it's a rock musical. I knew that was going to be strobe heavy. I saw Titanic a few weeks ago, off-Broadway show, over the top campy in every single sense of the word. I knew that show was going to be strobe heavy when I went into it. I wanted to see it anyway. I deliberately saw it when I saw it because I knew I'd be able to afford to take a migraine day afterward, which I ended up needing. In an ideal world, I would love to be able to see more kinds of theater. There's a new rock musical in development that I won't name here, but I've been following it for a while, and I will go to all of their concerts of that music and love and appreciate it, but I know that I will never be able to see that show. And that sucks. I also love singing rock musical music because of the sheer amount of gender euphoria involved in it, but I will never be able to be in one of those shows either, which also sucks. But at the end of the day, from one theater maker to another, you can do whatever you want. If you want to use some of these things I've listed here in your show because you think it's the best way to directorially get across what you want to get across, have at it. I'm not going to stop you, just be deliberate about it. Most of these things that could be potential access hazards for people exist in shows because nobody in the production team stops to think about it. And were this discussion happening in rehearsal rooms or during previews, they probably would have gone, oh, we can change this thing slightly to eliminate that problem. That's no issue at all. And it wouldn't be there, and that wouldn't change the quality of the show in any way. In the same way that, like, we stop and think, is that joke appropriate or offensive when writing a script? That level of second thought should be put into everything else so that we're not suddenly taking minority people out of the experience of seeing that show. All art is never going to be fully accessible. I don't expect it to be, nor do I ask it to be. But what's important to me is that people like me are taken into account when that art is being created, and that if the choice is to include something that could be an access issue, there's proper acknowledgement of and warning for that thing. I found that this industry wants to hide disability. Accessibility information is very hard to find on shows' websites. That's why I usually go straight to Seat Plan, which they have a section about it. But if there's a strobe warning or a content warning, it's a small sign in the lobby that a lot of people miss when they walk in. Put it in the playbill. If you can't print it in there, put it on a slip of paper inside of your program. Say where those warnings are so that they're actually helpful warnings, and not like, what was it? I saw a show recently that was like, there's a strobe 1 hour and 40 minutes into the act. Like, I'm not gonna check my watch during it. Just say at like the end of the act or after this song. Like, it's not really a spoiler if you just say there is a loud, like in Les Mis, they tell you there are gunshots in the show. That's not going to change. It doesn't spoil anything. You don't know where those gunshots go, but you know there are gunshots and you know where they are so that you can expect them and plug your ears before they happen because it's really clear on stage when they happen. What I would love is if theaters could be more upfront and honest about their accessibility or their lack thereof, and also put strobe warnings on your websites as well, because there are so many shows that I want to see but suspect they're probably strobe heavy, and I'm not paying $80+ to figure that out for myself, which means that I'm missing out on a lot of theater, and I'm not the only person who does theater this way. In a purely economic sense, if we want to put away like the whole people matter thing and we're just looking at numbers, shows are losing out on a lot of money for my demographic. Again, 1 in 10 people experience chronic migraines, and that is not the only disability that is impacted by the access issues we often see in theater. Everybody benefits from making things accessible and from having more knowledge about something. I know to look for strobe warnings because I have a friend with epilepsy who has to pay more attention to them than I do, and that was when I learned they were a migraine trigger for me. I didn't even know that before. I didn't look for them before. I know to look for content warnings because a friend of mine had frequent panic attacks, and that was how I learned that they were a helpful access tool for me, as well as minimize my anxiety headaches. I also know that, like, at the beginning of my videos, I give an image description of what you're looking at, and I've had people who are not blind and not low vision comment, wow, I didn't know that that was a helpful tool for me, but you had it and it helped me a lot. Like, people often don't realize they need tools until those tools are very obviously and clearly accessible to them, so we need to make our accessibility information more clear and more obvious. Art teaches us about humanity. It's not meant to be safe or to flatten itself for the palatability of others, but if a large portion of humanity cannot physically safely experience that art, that's where I have a problem. And if we make this stuff clearly visible and standard, more people will be able to experience the art that we've made. And that's what art's for, isn't it? Like, that's whatever. That's all I have for you on this topic for right now. I hope that you learned something from it. There's been a lot of discussion lately about DEI consultants and disability consultancy on relevant shows. I firmly believe that accessibility staging consultancy should also be a thing. Not that I know anybody else whose primary activist interest in theater revolves around this other than myself, but I'm sure other people like me exist out there somewhere in the universe and I've just yet to meet them, hopefully. If you're a creator and you want accessible staging consultancy, I will put my email down in the description with my sources and resources on the topic. Please reach out, please check those out. I am more than happy to help, and feel free to share this video with any other theater makers you may know, because every new person who thinks about this in what they do is gonna change the industry bit by bit. And not just with theater and dance, these principles carry over into filmmaking as well. Accessible filmmaking and design is also a thing. Some elements of visual art also benefit from this stuff. Also, let me know what kinds of things you want to see from theater to make it more accessible, if there's anything I missed in here, because there very probably is. And if there's any shows that I haven't reviewed yet that you want to hear my thoughts on, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to see them. This is a very unofficial adventure. I'm living solely by ticket lotteries and carefully managed budgets right now. Anyway, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.